Hello, my name is Jeremy Grant, and I'll be presenting research demonstrating how cognitive enrichment moderates the relationship between cognitive dysfunction and education quality in people with MS. And I'll also be sharing more recent findings from my dissertation showing how this relationship differs by race. Relatively few studies have examined cognitive reserve in people with MS, and those that have typically focused on years of education as the sole proxy of reserve in samples with limited ethnic diversity. Two important limitations of this approach. First, years of education does not sufficiently capture how people can build reserve through various activities outside of formal education. So, learning languages, playing musical instruments, having a cognitively demanding occupation, these are all examples of cognitively enriching activities that can contribute to cognitive reserve. And we also know from some research in MS specifically that intellectually enriching hobbies, such as reading or writing for leisure, can specifically contribute to reserve in this population. A second limitation of using years of education as the sole proxy of reserve is that it does not predict reserve equally among people from diverse ethno-racial backgrounds. So we know from the aging literature that specifically among Black Americans, tests of reading ability provide a better estimate of education quality than just asking years of education. And so therefore, it tells us more about the degree of reserve built through formal education than just asking someone how many years they've spent in school. To the best of our knowledge, there's been no published research on Black people with MS investigating cognitive reserve. And that's an important gap in the literature because we know that Black people with MS tend to have worse health outcomes in comparison to other racial or ethnic groups. Here on the right is the results of a 2010 study that examined over 7,000 people with MS in New York State. And on the x-axis, you'll see the EDSS score, which is a rating of disease severity, where higher scores indicate more severe MS. And on the y-axis is the percentage of people represented in each disease stage. And you can see quite clearly that Black people were overrepresented in the more severe disease stages and underrepresented in the more mild disease stages, whereas the reverse was true for the white participants. So these racial disparities in health outcomes are often attributed to the enduring effects of systemic racism and are particularly important in the Detroit area, which has some of the starkest disparities in education quality and health outcomes. I'll look no further than the difference between the city of Detroit and the neighboring town of Grosse Pointe, which has one of the largest gaps in median income between any two neighboring school districts in the US. So our two main research questions were, to what extent does cognitive enrichment help build a reserve against the effects of MS? And secondly, to what extent does the relationship between various proxies of reserve and cognitive dysfunction differ based on race? So we examined these questions in 82 adults with MS recruited from the Wayne State MS Treatment and Clinical Research Center. We had 50% Black and 50% white participants in our sample. And our participants completed a routine neurological examination, including an EDSS score, a variety of self-report questionnaires, as well as a brief neuropsychological evaluation, and received $25 for participating. We examined three main proxies of reserve in our study. First, self-reported years of education. Next, education quality, which was assessed using the RETAR, which is typically used to or conceptualized as a measure of premorbid functioning, but here we use it as an estimate of what people have actually learned through their schooling. Representation of their education quality. And then lastly, cognitive enrichment, which we examined using the cognitive reserve scale, a self-report questionnaire that includes various activities that people may have done throughout their lifespan that are theoretically believed to contribute to reserve, such as speaking multiple languages or playing a musical instrument or having intellectually enriching hobbies. And we primarily focused on enrichment in young adulthood. We had a variety of tests in our battery, but for this presentation, I'll just be focusing on the tests included in the BICAMS, which includes the SDMT and the learning trials of the BVMTR and the CBLT2. First, our descriptive statistics. You can see here that the participants in our sample were largely middle-aged, had symptom onset around age 35, predominantly female, which is consistent with what we see in MS, and were largely unemployed and on disability and had a moderate level of disease progression as assessed by the EDSS. And you can see that the Black participants had a slightly higher level of disease severity than the white participants, although this difference was not statistically significant. The two racial groups had similar levels of education and cognitive enrichment. So they were both around college educated and reported similar levels of engagement in various cognitively enriching activities across the lifespan and in young adulthood. However, the white participants had slightly higher education quality as assessed by the WATAR. And you can see that both groups performed in the average range. So this difference, although statistically significant, may not be clinically significant. Now for the measures of cognitive performance, you can see that the Black participants performed significantly worse than the white participants across the board. So they demonstrated slower processing speed and recalled fewer items on the BVMTR and the CBLT2. Next, we looked at the correlations between the measures of cognitive performance and the proxies of reserve. And what you see here is that education quality and cognitive enrichment were consistently related to cognitive performance, whereas years of education was not consistently related to cognitive performance. So this provides some early evidence that education quality and cognitive enrichment provide more useful information beyond years of education towards predicting cognitive performance in this sample. We also examined these relationships between a split between the Black and white participants, and you can see here that cognitive enrichment was consistently related to cognitive performance among the Black participants, but among the white participants, it was years of education that was the stronger predictor of cognitive performance. And so this, in addition to other analyses that we conducted, suggests that these proxies of reserve function differently between these two racial groups. We also hypothesized that we might see some differences in cognitive performance based on the combination of education quality and cognitive enrichment. So we divided our sample into 4 hypothetical groups, those with low education quality and low cognitive enrichment, those with high education quality and high enrichment, and those with either high enrichment or high education quality. And we hypothesized that there might be an additive effect such that the individuals with high education quality and high enrichment would perform best, whereas the individuals with low education quality and low enrichment would perform worst, and those with either high in one of those groups would perform somewhere in the middle. That's not exactly what we found. We did demonstrate that the low reserve group performed significantly worse than the other 3 groups across our different measures. However, there was no additive effect for the high reserve group. So there was no additive effect for the combination of having high education quality and high enrichment. So this provided some evidence that cognitive enrichment moderates the relationship between cognitive performance and education quality. We also examined the core principle underlying the theory of cognitive reserve, which is that reserve moderates the relationship between cognitive performance and some disease-related variable. And so in these graphs, you can see the EDSS once again on the x-axis, and the processing speed performance on the SDMT on the y-axis. And over here on this graph on the left, you can see that among the participants with low cognitive enrichment, there was a strong relationship between processing speed and disease severity, such that as disease severity increases, processing speed decreases or slows down, which is exactly what we would expect among people with MS. However, looking at the same relationship among people with high cognitive enrichment, you can see that the relationship almost disappears, that the strength of the relationship is much weaker, such that even among individuals with high disease severity, there's not as large of a drop-off in processing speed. So there's a weak relationship between disease severity and processing speed among individuals with high cognitive enrichment. Once again, demonstrating that cognitive enrichment can moderate or the effects of disease severity on cognition in people with MS. So in conclusion, this study really demonstrates how building up a reserve against the effects of MS can be achieved through many different paths. We showed that cognitive enrichment moderates the relationship between disease severity and cognitive performance, and that it's particularly important for people with MS who have low education quality or have not built up substantial reserve through formal education. However, cognitive enrichment may not provide any additional protection against the effects of MS among people with high educational quality. Either you get your reserve through a cognitive enrichment or through formal education or through as assessed by word recognition performance. We also demonstrated that the relationship between reserve and cognitive performance differs based on race. Among white people with MS, years of education was the better predictor of reserve, whereas among Black people with MS, cognitive enrichment was a better prediction of reserve and cognitive performance. Future studies should examine these same research questions using a larger, more ethnically diverse, community-based sample, and should include longitudinal designs or neuroimaging measures to examine brain reserve or other markers of disease progression. And in addition to race, examine socioeconomic disadvantage or other markers as a moderator of health outcomes. And the overarching goal of this research is to inform interventions for cognitive dysfunction in MS. And there's a great need for more methodologically rigorous research to support the use of cognitive enrichment as an intervention. I'd like to thank the Wayne State University Department of Neurology, as well as the Department of Psychology and the Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan Foundation for supporting this research. And a special thank you to all of my collaborators who helped bring this research to fruition. Thank you so much for stopping by my talk.